For the purpose of time, just so we can make sure we keep going, I'm just going to go ahead and start at 4. So, hello class. I'm glad I made the class a little bit easier as we're going along. Just know that, of course, we're not having a test anytime soon. We're going to have the test at the end. But hopefully you guys will be all prepared when it happens. We only have a few more weeks of class. It's almost over. Just go ahead, finish strong, keep on going. Hopefully today will be a little bit fun. That's my goal, is to make it kind of fun. So we're going to start with Decameron, and if we get through and finish, we can go on to The Wife of Bath. But if not, we'll just stay with Decameron, and I might actually record it all and then stop at the end of Decameron, and then we'll do The Wife of Bath on another recording. Both of these texts, though, and I give you the option for The Wife of Bath. You can read it in the original Middle English, or you can read it in regular English, translated. Either way is fine. This, however, is in Italian, so, and it's in kind of older Italian. So I'm not going to make you read the Decameron in Italian any more than I'd make you read the Inferno in Italian. But the Decameron is a very interesting story in that it is actually a collection of 100 tales. And these are folk tales. A lot of these tales are not new. In fact, you can find other versions of them in the Canterbury Tales, in the Heptameron, which was a French kind of collection of tales written by Marguerite de Navarre. But you can, the truth is, we have a lot of folk tales, kind of like, we know a lot of stories. If I tell you, well, what's the story of Red Riding Hood? You guys all know the story. And it's not just because Grimm put them all down or something, or people recorded them as fairy tales. It's because these are part of our culture and have been part of our culture for a long time. If you go to any different place, whether it's Africa, any continent, Africa, Asia, the Americas, you're going to find in the indigenous population a lot of folk tales like this too. So all that the Cameron does, all that Boccaccio, the Italian writer who kind of compiled all of these, did, he didn't invent all of them. Instead, he invented a frame story. And the story is actually interesting because it kind of bridges the gap between the medieval period and the Renaissance, because one of the biggest causes of the Renaissance was actually the bubonic plague. And the bubonic plague killed, we don't know exactly how many because there wasn't a census, but it killed somewhere between 35 and 50% of the European population over about 150 years. And it just came in waves, kind of like, flu comes in waves every year, but this was a very deadly disease. And because medicine was so backward in Europe, especially, tons of people died. And so far, far greater in Europe than in the entire world as a whole. But the bubonic plague had very customary, very interesting details to it. So it was a grotesque disease. Even today, if you look, and I'm not suggesting you do, but if you looked at bubonic plague pictures online, you would see things you do not want to see. And these are modern pictures because the bubonic plague actually still exists. It's not a huge plague anymore. Usually in the United States, about 8 to 10 people a year get it. And yet they rarely die of it because we have antibiotics and we have other treatment options, and we catch it faster, and there's all the stuff we can do. For people at this time, though, that was not the case. And so literally tons and tons of people are dying in most of the big cities. And so if you want to survive the plague, the number one thing you do is you leave the city, because we didn't know it at the time, but the plague was passed along by the fleas that were carried around by rats. Everybody in town had rats. Everybody. There was no, oh no, rat-free mansion. No, they all had rats, and they all dealt with them. But the rats, what happened is the rats would crawl around on the ground and in stuff while we're sleeping, and then all the little fleas off the rats would jump off the rats and they'd get onto people. And did people have fleas? Yes, they did. Fleas were a common occurrence. Everyone had fleas. Many people dealt with lice continually. I mean, it was a very itchy population. But unfortunately, they also passed along the bubonic plague. And so what's interesting about this frame is what he creates is a story where there are 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, all of them probably my guess is somewhere between 16 and 22, 23, so young. It's almost like a young adult novel or something. Well, these people actually see each other at a funeral for someone who has died of the plague again. And they're living in a city and they say, we really need to get out of the city if we want to avoid this. We don't want any more people to die. And so what they do is they choose to go to the country, to one of their houses. This is an upper middle class or upper class group of people. And then they spend 10 days hanging out in the sunshine and telling stories to each other and keeping each other entertained while they wait out the wave of plague so that they don't die. And in the meantime, what they decide is every day for 10 days, each person is going to tell a story. And the stories are linked very loosely. It's almost, there is some discussion in between stories where they speak about the last story and invite the next person to talk. But it's mostly like each day, one of the 10 people gets to pick what the theme is. And so sometimes it's over religion, sometimes it's over love, sometimes it's a sad story, but you never know what you're going to get from people given a particular prompt. And so even in a given day, the 10 stories could be really funny to really tragic to really goofy to really, you just never know, political. And there's a whole range. There's something for everybody, essentially. And so this is the very first day. And this is really essentially what they do is kind of set up. Remember, this is what we're talking about. And it could be they could be talking about tricks, or they could be talking about love, or but they kind of set all of this up really early. So the very first day, the person who's in charge will say, this is what I want a story on. And if you don't like a story, you just skip to the next one. Now, these are really hard to read all at once. So never try to just pick up the Decameron and read it like a novel, because nothing fits together. These are really very, very, and some of them are literally a page long short stories. So they're just tiny tales. Some of them are longer than others, just like the Canterbury Tales are. But this is the beginning. It's funny because they're all in short form, and yet this was the beginning of literature available to people in their own language. So for the longest time, the people that kind of dominated writing were clergy, and most of what they read and wrote was in Latin, which most people didn't speak or read. And so if you weren't clergy, you really didn't have any access to anything. But along with being able to write in the vernacular, what they call the common language of an area. So in Italy, of course, it would be Italian. In Spain, it would be Spanish. In France, it would be French. In England, it would be English, And so without any access to reading material, though, people weren't going to learn to read. Once these began to be popular and kind of spread throughout Europe and spread throughout different countries in the vernacular language, people started learning to read, and that's the reality. So no longer did they have to depend on a bard telling a tale like Beowulf orally over several successive nights. They could read it for themselves. And this was a huge, huge step towards the Renaissance, because to have a Renaissance, you have to have people who can read. And that's essentially what happens is we develop a merchant and middle class that never existed before, and they can read, and they have enough money to burn, they can buy more books. And that's what happens. So books like the Decameron and the Canterbury Tales and the Heptameron in French become the thing, in the same way that the Divine Comedy of Dante becomes the thing because it's written in Italian. And so even though it's in poetry, the Decameron is not. It is written completely in prose, and it's meant to be very accessible to audiences at that time. So this was popular literature. This is like a Tom Clancy novel or short stories for young people or something like that. Although some of them are a little less than okay for young people. In this case, though, so this third story on the first day is one of the more famous stories in the Decameron. I always teach it because it's such a weird story. And no matter what your religious affiliation, there's a lot you can learn from it. And there's certainly a thread of conversation that's been happening between three monotheistic faiths. So if you are also taking humanities, this is a really interesting story for you too, because you know about the origins of those three places, of those three monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and you know that they're all kind of connected. And yet they also fight amongst each other a lot. And they even do today. That it's very common, even for sects within a particular religion, to fight amongst each other. And so this is a very interesting tale. It's a parable. So it's in the form of something like what Jesus would say, in the New Testament. He's telling a story to express a truth. Okay. It's sort of, there's a myth to it, if you want to think about it that way. So in this particular, you don't have to worry so much about the conversation that they're talking about, but instead, what you want to do is you can look at how they introduce what they're talking about. So this is a story by Nephili. So that just means she's the one who's telling it. But essentially she says, she goes, this is a story about, actually this is by Philomena, not Nephili. Nephili told the second tale, but Philomena says that there's a perilous case that once betided a Jew. So she's going to talk about an actual Jew, a person. For that, now these are all Christian people. These are all Catholic. There's not even any Protestantism at this point. It's all Catholicism, all Catholic Christianity in Italy. And for that, but this is a story about someone who was not Christian. Okay. And it having already been excellent, well spoken, both of God and of the verity of our faith, it should not henceforth be forbidden us to descend to the doings of mankind and the events that have befallen them. So she's essentially saying this actually says, we've already said a lot of good things about our faith, so this should not question that we believe in Christianity. Okay. So it's, in other words, don't get upset if this doesn't jive with what you think about Christianity. Because remember, Christianity was the only faith for people who were followers of Catholicism. So Judaism was wrong. Islam was wrong. They were both heretical. They were both not true. Okay. And then she says, she goes, essentially, you must know that mine, my friends, that like as folly oftentimes draweth folk forth of happy estate and casted them into the utmost misery, even so does good sense extricate the wise man from the great perils and place him in assurance and tranquility. And in other words, this is not about faith. This is about being smart. So this is a way to think about it so you don't get religiously offended. Okay. Because the truth is there are a lot of people who would read this and would be offended. And that's of all three faiths. So it's not like there's one in particular. Remember, they were very adamant. Each group is often, and even today, very adamant of the fact that they are right and the other two are wrong. Okay. So this is about a man named Saladin. Well, partly. He's actually the emir. He's the Sultan of Babylon, but he is a Saracen. Okay. That means he is a Muslim. Okay, so he's part of the Islamic territories that are in in the Middle East and in northern Africa. And they have already had, and of course in Spain as well at this point. And they already have had a lot of altercations. We had the Crusades, so there was hundreds of years of battles in between the Muslims and Christians over this. So, but the Sultan of Babylon, Saladin, having in diverse wars and in the exercise of his extraordinary munificences expended his whole treasure. So in other words, he's run out of money and he needs to get another sum of money. And he's not sure where he's going to get it because in a lot of faiths, lending money for interest is illegal. It used to be illegal for a Christian to lend money with interest. That's obviously not the case today. But at that time, the only people who could be bankers like that were Jewish. And so most Jews who had any money at all were that was one of the few professions they were allowed to have. Most professions were cut off from someone who practiced Judaism. And so he's essentially, what happens is Saladin needs to borrow money, and he called to mind a rich Jew named Melchizedek. Don't worry, Melchizedek, you can pronounce it all sorts of ways. You're never going to, and if you kind of sort of mistype it in the test, who cares? But he had lent money before in other places, and he'd heard about him, and he bethought himself that this latter had the wherewithal to oblige him. So he'd have money But he was so miserly that he would never have done it of his free will. And Saladin was loath to use force with him. So in other words, the guy could lend it. He had plenty of money to lend, but he was really cautious about where he lent it. And so Saladin didn't want to force him and say, you have to lend me money, which he could technically do in an Islamic country because Jews were there at the behest, at the allowance of the Muslims who were in control. And so he could kick him out of the country if he wouldn't, but he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to be mean. So essentially, he was trying to find a way to make it so that the Jew might serve him and yet not do it through some violence. Okay, so how can I trick the guy into doing what I want him to do? So he sends for Melchizedek and receives him, and then says, honest man, I've understood from diverse persons that you are a very learned man and deeply versed in matters of divinity. And so he asks him this question, which is a stumper, at least it should be. He says, I would like to know of thee, whether the three laws thou repeatest, whether of the three laws, in other words, which of the three faiths you think are true, Jew, Muslim, or Christian. Okay, which is the true faith? Now, the Jew, who was in truth a man of learning and understanding, he's a smart dude, perceived but too well that Saladin looked to entrap him in those words, so he might quarrel with him, and bethought himself that he could not praise any of the three more than the others without giving him the occasion he sought. So in other words, he can't say, oh, well, Judaism is obviously the truth because he is a Jew, because then Saladin would argue with him. But he couldn't say, oh, Islam is obviously the true one, because then Saladin would know that he was just brown nosing. And so, and he would have no reason to say Christianity was, because he was neither Christian nor was Saladin. So instead, he says he sharpened his wits, as became one who felt himself in the need of an answer by which he might not be taken at advantage. And there speedily occurred to him that which it behooved him to reply, and he said, so in other words, oh, I thought of it. I thought of the story. My lord, the question that you propound to me is a nice one, and to acquaint you with that which I think of the matter, it behooveth me to tell you a little story, which you shall hear. So this is the parable. So there's an intro, and then there's another intro of why he's telling the story. And this is the story. Okay, but this is where the crux of it all is. Now, the frames are important, but this is what's really matters. So, and I mistake not, I mind to have many a time heard tell that there was once a great man and a rich, who among other very precious jewels in his treasury had a very goodly and costly ring. So here's this man, he's a great man, and he has a very expensive ring. And he says he wants to do, essentially, his job is to leave it in perpetuity to his descendants. Okay, so he declared that whichever of his sons should at his death be found in possession thereof by his bequest unto him should be recognized as his heir and be held of all others in honor and reverence as chief and head. So he says, this ring, he declares to everybody publicly, whichever of my sons has this ring when I die will be my heir, and he will be due all the honor and reverence, and he will be the chief of the group. He'll become the new king, essentially. And so he to whom the ring was left held a like course with his own descendants. So essentially, each time as the generations went along, the man who was king would give that ring to his most special son, who would be king, and then would essentially be the one picked. So the chosen, the dad would choose the next heir from all of his sons, and then the next time, same thing. That guy who was heir would choose an heir from all of his sons, but it wasn't always the first person, is what the oldest or something. And so finally, through many generations, came at last into the possession of a man who had three goodly and virtuous sons. So they're all three of the men, his sons, are good people. They're goodly and virtuous, all very obedient to their father, wherefore he loved them all three alike. Now, this is the key. He loved them alike. The young men, knowing the usance of the ring, each for himself, desiring to be the most honored among his folk as best he might, besought his father, who was now an old man, to leave him the ring when as he came to die. So each son of the three says, Dad, please, when you die, could you please give me the ring? Because they think that they're the best kid of the three. The worthy man who loved them all alike, we repeat that, and knew not himself how to choose which he had preferred to leave the ring. Liefer just means I'd rather leave the ring, but thought himself, having promised it to each, to seek to satisfy all three, and privily let make by a good craftsman 2 other rings. So the man feels pressure, and he loves his other sons. He loves them all equally, the exact same. They are alike to him. Okay, this is clear. They were so like under the, okay, so he makes 2 more rings, and those 2 rings look exactly like the first one. He himself scarce knew which was the true ring. When he came to die, he secretly gave each one of his sons his ring, wherefore each of them, seeking after their father's death to occupy the inheritance and the honor and denying it to the others, produced his ring. So at the deathbed, he gave one kid the ring. He says, here's the ring. I've given it to you. And the kid's like, yay. He leaves. Next son gets called in. Here's the ring. I give it to you. Kid's like, yay, I got picked. All 3 of them got picked. And only the dad, knew truly which ring was the right one, which one was the original and not one of the 2 copies. Okay. And then, so after he dies, after their father's death, they all get to and say, here's the ring, ta-da! And in witness of his right, and the 3 rings being found so like unto one another, that the true might not be known, the question which was the father's very heir abode pending, and yet pendeth. In other words, no one has ever figured out which of the 3 sons deserved the ring. And so I say to you, my Lord, of the 3 laws to the 3 peoples given up of God the Father, whereof you question me, each people deemeth itself to have his inheritance, his true law, and his commandments, but of which in very deed hath them, even as of the rings, the question yet pendeth. In other words, the answer is no one knows, because God gave each one of them a mandate. And so each of the 3 groups thinks that they're right. And rightly so, because God blessed them. So he takes essentially a very strange turn here. Instead of saying, oh, well, it's obviously Judaism, or obviously, Christianity, or obviously Islam, he says all 3 will forever think of themselves as the right one. And we will never know which one truly is, because God loved all 3 groups. They are all his children. That is mind-blowing. Even today, to express this kind of, this kind of idea, you go to a big meeting at the Rock for Muslims, and you say this, people would freak out. If you went to a group of Jews worshiping in a temple and you said this, a bunch of Jews would freak out. And if you came into a convention of Christians here in the United States and you said this, people would freak out. So it's radical. It is one of the most radical stories at that time. And yet for a lot of people today, that's become part of the issue with faith, is when you say, okay, this faith is right, and then all these other ones are wrong. The number one question that comes up next is, how do you know? And what this story says is, you can't. There is no way to prove who's right. That's the point of faith. Everyone who believes they're right believes it, and you can't make them unbelieve it. But they're not going to be able to convince other people that their faith is wrong. And so we're all stuck. And yet, what does that suggest? We should be tolerant. What happens? Saladin realizes that the Jews really smart. He had excellently well contrived to escape the snare. Wherefore he concluded to discover him his need. So he just said, okay, look, I just did this to try to trick you, and I need to borrow some money. And so he confessed what he had in mind to do. And the Jew freely furnished him with all that he required. And the Sultan after satisfied him in full. So in other words, he paid back his loan, and he gave him very great gifts and still had him to friend and maintained him about his own person in high and honorable estate. So Saladin was not offended by the story. He said, that's smart. And in some ways, it's a suggestion too, that if we really think about it without getting upset, and we really, especially the more we learn about what the other faiths believe, the less we're going to be offended, because we're going to understand that they have threads of truth as well. And so it's a very tolerant story. But and there's still people, I mean, there's actually recently, I think within the last couple of decades, someone wrote a play based on this. So it's still a story that for a lot of people has appeal, especially people who are in different, who are trying to deal with different faith questions. And for people who are seeking, it's definitely one of those things. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll back up to the top, because it's easier to find the next story. So we go from day 1 to day 9, story 7. And so it's just easier to use the clicks to do that than to try to do the other ones. So let's see. 6, doodly doodly doo, 9. Yeah. And then the 7th story. Now, none of these, it's really hard. One reason we're only doing 2, it's really hard to like there's no titles for any of these, so you kind of have to read the little blurbs about each one. But this is the 7th story of the 9th day, and it's about Talano de Moles, okay, and his wife. And it's more of a cautionary tale type of thing. So this is much more, there are actually a couple of equivalents in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The nun's priest tale is kind of like this. It's more of, has it's a fable that has a moral to it. And so this is one of more of those kind of folk stories that has a moral. Now, the truth is you can find these anywhere too. They're in every culture. I was teaching African mythology in one of my classes back in Washington State. And there was a tale, and it was very much like the boy who cried wolf, but it was a girl, and she was doing, she was actually taking on the boogeyman. And this was in Africa. And eventually the boogeyman ate her. And it was one of those, my students were reading it and they went, at the end. But the cautionary tales have to have bad stuff happen, or how are they cautioning us of anything? So sometimes that's the way it goes too. That's just something to keep in mind. So it is a little, I mean, mostly this is dealing a lot with karma, or you get what you deserve, or you need to heed warnings, or bad things will happen to you, that kind of stuff. But this is it's much more about a woman who is not the kind of wife she should be. And so this is also a warning tale for women. And you have to understand that, because that's going to affect what it is. Now, this is also told by a woman. And so it's not just men who are going to say, now women, you need to do this and this and this. Women will put the same warning to their men. And it's not about being, subservient or only obedient. It's about being a partner in a relationship. And hey, Tracy, you finally came. Yay. I already talked about the first story. So we're already in the 7th story on day 9 of the Decameron. Okay. The one about the wolf.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a warning story about how you should behave as a wife, and saying the types of things you shouldn't do, because this woman is not the kind of woman she should be, especially she is not the kind of wife she should be. Okay. And part of it is that she doesn't, we can look at why. Well, let's look at all the things she does wrong once we've gone through it. So, but this is told by Pomponea herself. Okay. So Pomponea is telling this story, and it's about essentially talking about dreams and how you need to pay attention to your dreams. That's how she sets it up, but that's not actually sort of really what it's saying. Okay. It is. It's more about believing when people warn you about something, and trusting them, and not assuming that they have ultra, you know, some type of other agenda, and that, you know, especially if they're your spouse. Okay. So she says, well, I don't know that you were, if anybody knows Talano de Males. And he was a worshipful man. Okay. And he took a young wife called Margarita, and she was very beautiful, but she was so humorsome. And humorsome does not mean she's humorous or funny or happy or jolly. It means her four humors, bile and red, the black bile and the green bile, and all, that her humors are out of whack. So she's irritable, she's grumpy, she's ill conditioned, so she's always cranky about something. And froward's probably the worst of all these words, because she puts herself out there and is obnoxious and vocal when she should be quiet, because remember, she's a woman. So there is definitely some stuff about women's roles, but a lot of it also is also about being a mean person, and that's what she also is. So she says, she goes, she would do not of other folks' judgment, nor could others do aught to her liking. So she didn't care what other people thought, and she'd tell them that. But everything that other people did made her angry. So she would complain constantly. And he said, and it says, the which was irksome as it was to Talano to endure, her husband. Nevertheless, as he could do no otherwise, he had to put up with her. So she's not a great wife. It chanced one night, though, being with this Margarita of his at an estate he had in the country. So he's a pretty wealthy guy. He has more than one estate. And they're having a country, and they're sleeping in the country, and him seemed in his sleep, he saw his wife go walking into a wood, and he recognized it. It's a wood not far from the house. And as she went, it seemed to him, that's what him seemed means. It seemed to him there came forth of a thicket a great and fierce wolf, which sprang straight at her throat and pulled her to the ground, and forcing himself to carry, so he's going to carry her off by the neck. And she screams for aid. And after she winning free of his fangs, it seemed he had marred all of her throat and face. So essentially, he dreams that his wife is out in the woods. She's attacked by a wolf, and the wolf kind of like mangles her face. So she was really pretty, this Margarita, but he dreams that it destroys her throat and it mangles up her face and makes her awful. Accordingly, so he wakes up and he goes, wife, albeit thy forwardness hath never suffered me to have a good day with you, yet it would grieve me if anything bad happens to you, if any ill should betide thee. Okay. So he says, I know you've never been happy a single day of our marriage, but still, I don't want anything bad to happen to you, honey. So he's being nice. So please listen to my counsel. Please don't go out of the house today. And she says, why? And he says, this is what happened in my dream. And she shook her head and said, who wileth thee ill, dreameth thee ill? You pretend you're being careful of me, but you dream of me that which would fain see. In other words, you're dreaming about me getting my throat chewed up and my face gnarled because you want that to happen. And you can be assured I will be careful both today and always not to let that happen to me. And he says, I knew you would say this. I knew you'd like argue with me. For such thanks still hath he who combeth a scald head. In other words, who tries to brush a head with no hair on it. But believe it as you listen. Please believe me as you listen to my story, because I'm telling it for your good. And once more, please, I'm asking you, don't go out into the wood. And she goes, I'll do it. And after it fell a saying to herself, you saw how artfully yonder man thinketh to have made me afraid to go out to the wood today. So she says, oh, it's okay. I won't. I'll stay inside. That's what she tells him, but she's lying. So then she pretends to be meek and listen to him, but she doesn't. But she says, she goes, no. She goes, he wanted to make me afraid to go out. But that's only because, doubtless, he hath given some trull or the other tryst there, and would not have me find him with her. So he's going outside to meet another lady. So she's instantly jealous and distrusts him. He says, please don't go out. I had this bad dream. You were chewed up by a wolf. And she goes, you're just saying that because you want to go meet some chick out in the woods yourself. And so he says, she says, essentially, I'm not going to be stupid. I should be a right simpleton if I didn't understand what he was doing and believed him for what he said. But no, he's not going to have his will. Nay, though I abide there all day, I'm going to go outside in the woods and figure out what's going on. And so her husband left, and she went out the other door and betook herself as most secretly that she might straight to the wood. She goes exactly where he tells her not to go, because she thinks that's where he's going to have his assignation with some woman. Hid herself in the thickest part of the wood, standing attention and looking now here and now there, so that she could see who was going to come. And as she abode on this wise, she doesn't think she's into any danger. Behold, here comes a terrible great wolf. And she scarce could she say, Lord, aid me. So she calls out for help, and it flies at her throat and lays fast hold of her, and proceeded to carry her off as if she were a lambkin. She could neither cry nor aid herself nor on otherwise. So sore was her gullet, so she couldn't cry out. Her throat had been cut up. And the wolf, carrying her off, would assuredly have throttled her, so she would be dead, had he not encountered certain shepherds who shouted at him and constrained him to loose her, to let her loose. The shepherds knew her and carried her home in a piteous plight, where after long tending by the physicians she was healed. But she had all her throat and a part of her face marred on such wise that before she was really pretty, but now she's really ugly, very foul of favor. And wherefore, being ashamed to appear whereas she might be seen, she many a time bitterly repented her of her frowardness and her perverse denial to put faith in a matter which cost her nothing in her husband's true dream. In other words, from that point on, I mean, it was too late to save her, except to save her life. But she lost all of her beauty, and she probably can't talk very well anymore anyway. But she, now she bitterly repents that she didn't listen to her husband. So there's the lesson. But in the meantime, I mean, she doesn't like get a close call. American movies are really great at the close call, where they're warned or something, and all this bad stuff could happen, and it almost does, but then it doesn't. Well, not in this world. No, in this world, it could very well happen, and then it does. And that's kind of where we are with Boccaccio. Does that make sense, Tracy? But it is sort of a girl thing, like this is how women are supposed to behave, but it's also a pay attention to the people who are supposed to love you. When they warn you against things, listen to them, and don't just go off and do whatever you want. And don't lie. Don't say, no, sure, I'll do exactly what you say, and then don't do it. So it's about a lot of things. It's about trust the people who love you, listen to people who are wiser or in charge, and that's of course husband over wife. Obedience is definitely part of this, but it's not the biggest part. It's also, be a nice person. I mean, the husband, as much as she wasn't a very nice wife, he was trying to be nice to her. He was genuinely trying to save her life, and she didn't appreciate that at all. And so in the end, she got exactly what he warned her would happen if she went outside. And that's kind of where that goes. So that's the two. I'm going to go ahead and stop that recording, and then I'll just start it again, and we'll do the Wife of Bath because we have time.